So at a time when British taxpayers have to contend with widespread budget cuts, why should the British government still be offering aid abroad to anybody?
Well, this is not soft-hearted altruism, as we set out in the pamphlet. This is Britain's national interest being pursued with vigour as well. And it's not just aid from Britain. Britain benefits hugely from this. How? Firstly, by tackling instability. Instability and ungoverned space, for example, in Somalia, threatens us as well as destroying the livelihoods of the people who live in Somalia. Last year in Somalia, there were more British passport holders training in terrorist camps to do us ill than in any other country of the world. So tackling instability overseas, which and conflict is development in reverse, really, is in our national interest as well. The other thing, of course, is that trying to promote prosperity and markets in countries with which we have a historic link, which is basically most of the places where we are working on development, will rebound to the benefit of our children and our grandchildren, because those markets will enrich us as well as enriching the people who are there. So British development policy is not a sort of optional extra, it's not an add-on. And the whole purpose of this pamphlet is to demonstrate that at a time of austerity, this spending, which some people think is an easy win to cut, actually is the very reverse, and is a huge investment in Britain's future prosperity and security going forward.
But there's been so much critique of aid over the last 10 and 20 years. You know, doesn't much of the money we give to foreign governments, particularly in the most unstable countries, mostly end up in the personal bank accounts of their leaders?
Well, the answer to that is no, but underlying everything we do in development has to be a search for results, and we have to know, so that we can look the British taxpayer in the eye and tell them that the money is being well spent, that we're getting 100 pence of results for our aid spending for every hard-earned tax pound we spend. And one of the reasons why I reduced by 50% the general budget support that Britain was giving under the last government was because I couldn't track the money, and I couldn't see when I was the development secretary that we were getting those results. So we were utterly ruthless in making sure that where the money is not being spent well, we stop it or make sure that it is spent well.
But doesn't value for money often mean that DFID and others simply spend their money on short-term goods that can be counted, you know, mosquito nets or vaccines, while skimping on longer-term, harder-to-measure investments such as school and healthcare systems? How can you measure value for money in something like aid?
It's not true to say that you can only measure things that are short-term. You know, a lot of development work is generational. It's very long-term indeed. But that is, if that's allowed to be an excuse for the development world not to account for what it's doing, then that is simply not acceptable. We have to be able to explain all the work we do in terms that British taxpayers who are funding this effort can understand and accept. And if we can't do that, then we should look very hard indeed at that spending.
Can you give me an example? What's a way in which can you point to a long-term program that is accountable, that can be can be measured?
The reforms to CDC, what used to be called the Commonwealth Development Corporation, very radical reforms that this government has made to ensure that over the longer term, the parts of the world where the magic of the private sector has yet to be deployed, we can get in pioneer investment, pioneer capital, and also patient investment, which shows the markets that there is an area of interest to them, but it may be early days and they need other people to go in first. The CDC, as the British government's 100% owned development finance institute, is the right vehicle to do that. And one of the points I make in the pamphlet is that over the next 30 to 50 years, I would expect to see CDC being much more evidenced as the British government's prime international development effort around the world than DFID, as countries become more wealthy, as they lift themselves out of poverty. It's very important that people can see that having a rule of law which encourages investors is just as much part of development, tackling corruption and so forth, as clean water and sanitation. And that's one of the points that we're trying to get across in this pamphlet, about the importance of pioneer investment in the parts of the world where investment has not yet taken root. It's very interesting in India. There are parts of India where if you had £1 million to invest, you could do it very easily through normal market mechanisms, but there are other parts in the poor areas of India where you couldn't invest any money at all because the mechanisms to do so do not exist. And one of the things we want DFID and CDC to do is to tackle that head on in difficult parts of the world and show how if you are able to invest in basic ways, that will be good for the investor, but also good for the very poor people in whose community you're investing.
Isn't the idea of a government-funded investment company, particularly if you think it's going to last 30 or 50 years, kind of a contradiction in terms? Shouldn't private capital be doing this?
Well, private capital is quite cowardly. It won't invest unless, at the first sight of any danger, capital takes flight. And what CDC, as the government's, the British taxpayers' Development Finance Institute can do, is it can take a longer view. It doesn't have to get commercial returns. It doesn't go to places where the market is already operating. If CDC didn't do that, which it didn't before this coalition government came to power, then there's absolutely no case, in my view, for not privatising it. There's no case for the government owning it. There has to be something extra which the private sector can't do. And that is the new CDC. They are able to deploy what I call pioneer capital in the areas I've described, which India is not a bad example, but also patient capital because they don't require the immediate market return. Of course, the money must wash its face. It must not be lost. There's no worse example of private enterprise than accepting that it'll lose money. We can't do that. We must always expect to recover the capital, but patient capital, which doesn't require the sort of market returns that you see in private equity funds and so on, can lead the way, and that is incredibly important in development.
Although presumably if it works, it will go out of business.
Yes, it will encourage. I mean, one of the reasons why we reformed CDC was because we saw, for example, in Sierra Leone, that instead of CDC being one of the first people to invest in a fund in a very poor country, they were actually the 7th or 8th. And that showed they were not doing the job which most of us would expect a Development Finance Institute like CDC to do.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.